Hello and welcome to the Headache Doctor podcast, where on this podcast, it's our mission to educate and empower everyone with headaches and migraines so that you can break free from a life of fear of your next headache or migraine and dependence on medication. In today's podcast, I thought we would go back to an episode I did in 2022 on vestibular migraine. Now, vestibular migraine is it's something we see here at Novera. It's one of the most debilitating types of migraine because it's like taking a migraine and then adding dizziness to it. And oftentimes the dizziness is just constant. It's always there. Never really goes away. So if you have neck tension, a headache, and then occasionally a debilitating throbbing, pounding sensation, and then you're also dizzy, it's really frustrating because imagine our healthcare system not understanding how to truly treat the headache or the migraine symptom, but then adding this layer of dizziness, it's even more confusing. And so it adds layers of confusion and trying to find relief, but it also adds layers of disability because it can impact driving. Oftentimes, if you have vestibular migraine, these people, they're not able to drive. They don't feel confident with driving. So they rely on others to get them to and from places, and you're kind of homebound. You don't feel like going out in public. You're nauseous maybe all the time. It's really rough. It's one of the most listened to podcasts we have. Part of the reason I think it's one of the most listened to is because when you're searching for things online, and you type in vestibular migraine, there's probably not a lot of material out there that really answers the question as to why. Definitely not in podcast form. I don't know how many podcasts would really dive into vestibular migraine. You have in the world of whether it's social media or search engines or like the internet putting information out there, you do have a fair amount of individuals that are creating platforms based on their experience of being dizzy. So you have like the dizzy dietitian, the dizzy doctor. You have there's actually other physical therapists in that space that have platforms that they have their own experience with dizziness. Generally, that's what happens, and then they're educating others on how to manage dizziness. Now, I've actually had several patients interact with other providers in this space. And then I was just interacting with, again, just some other pages on Instagram in particular, and just looking at what content is out there. And what I've heard from patients and then interacting on a personal side, it felt, I guess hopeless might sound like too strong of a word, but it was lacking solutions. I'll put it that way. And so largely what was out there was sort of this management of the symptoms in a sense of like stabilizing, avoiding things that are triggers, grounding and managing in a sense of, you have migraine, you have vestibular migraine, you have triple PD, you have BPPV, you have these things that cause dizziness, but there was really no sense of like, here's why it's happening and how we solve that problem. So this podcast, I want to get to the why. We're going to talk about one of the most overlooked whys behind vestibular migraine. We're going to break down the three different components, the three systems that if one of the systems is off, or if multiple systems are off, that's what would cause us to be dizzy. And then if we understand the three systems involved, and then we can evaluate those appropriately, then we can get to a solution-driven approach. And we're not just sort of grounding, stabilizing, avoiding, but we're actually leaning into the thing that's causing it, and we can find more of a long-term solution and a solution that really works. Okay, so the three systems, let's start here. Understanding the anatomy and the different structures that allow us to not be dizzy, to walk around, to use an elevator, to to run, to drive in a car. We do all these things, and there's so many inputs that our brain has to pay attention to and to ignore. And it's able to do that efficiently and relatively remarkably using these three systems when they operate well. The first one is our visual system. Visual system meaning our eyes and how our eyes coordinate. If we track objects, if there's objects in our peripheral vision, if there's an object moving close to us and we need to focus in on it, our visual system and how our eyes coordinate needs to be functioning properly in order for us to not be dizzy. Now, we can compensate, and that compensation can go on for a period of time where we're not dizzy, but the visual system having this sort of like discoordination, the inability to track objects, the inability to converge on objects, so watch an object as it gets close to your face, the eyes moving, coordinating together, or a lack of that ability to do that could lead to dizziness. And so seeing an optometrist, neurooptometrist, going through vision therapy, checking your eyeglasses, making sure your prescription hasn't changed, things like that are important in trying to solve this problem with dizziness. So that's number one is vision. Number two is our vestibular system. So the vestibular system would be the inner ear, the vestibule. It has three what are called semicircular canals, and it has fluid within those canals. Now that fluid moves if you go up and down an elevator, if you swivel your head left and right, if you tip your head, nod forward and back. That fluid is able to sort of provide a counter influence on these little hair-like structures within that organ, within the vestibular organ. And the fluid moves in the opposite direction. So if you move your head, the fluid will kind of stay in one position. Think of like an inner tube, and if you shift the inner tube left and right, the fluid inside, because there's very little friction and because it's a fluid, it doesn't necessarily follow the same pattern as the inner tube. And that's what our brain uses. It's that same sort of mechanism. It uses that with sensors that sense what the water's actually doing to understand if we should be dizzy, if our eyes need to do something to respond to the head movements, or if we're fine and we can just and we can accommodate to whatever movements without feeling dizzy. So that's where, I mean, if you're on like a little merry-go-round at a playground or something and you just spin, our vestibular system and our visual system, potentially our neck as well, but they're all working very hard to keep up and try to accommodate, and it stresses them out enough where once you stop, not only is like the fluid in your inner ear potentially disrupted, but your eyes are having to track or trying to track, and all of that needs time to catch up, and that's why you're generally dizzy right after you get off. So anyways, those two systems. The vestibular system is interesting because those three semicircular canals, one of the mechanisms for dizziness is known as BPPV, so benign paroxysmal positional vertigo. Positional, the word positional in that is important because it is reliant on gravity and the position of your head in order to trigger the dizziness. So what happens in BPPV is you have these little crystals, they're called otoconia, and they'll find their way into a position in the vestibular organ that they're not supposed to be in. They kind of are dislodged from those hair-like structures. And as they sort of float around in that canal, in the semicircular canal, they'll disrupt the flow of fluid. Okay, and as they disrupt the flow of fluid, it changes the input that those little hair-like structures are receiving. And so every time you move, okay, so you're laying down in bed, you roll over. Well, when you roll over, that could trigger the dizziness. And what's happening is instead of the fluid without any obstruction in it, giving this sort of pure signal to those hair-like structures, and then your brain realizes I don't have to be dizzy. Instead of that, you rotate, that crystal rotates, but then there's sort of this lag period, and as it's finding its way around that semicircular canal, it triggers those hair-like structures and even the fluid to move so that the vestibular organ feels like you're moving, And so it sends the signal to your brain like, hey, we're spinning, and the eyes accommodate. So your eyes start twitching and you feel like, whoa, I'm going to fall over. That only lasts for about 60 seconds or less. And the reason it's 60 seconds or less is because as soon as the fluid calms down and that little crystal or the otoconia finds its way back to like a settling position, you're fine. The dizziness will go away. There might be a little bit of like nausea or like off feeling, but for the most part, less than 60 seconds, it's real intense, and then it calms down. So it's the type of dizziness where you have to hold on. Like if you're standing, you're probably going to fall over. Think of if you just got off that merry-go-round and you try to stand up, like most people are just going to be tipping to one side, probably fall over. Maybe you take some steps. Like it's real intense dizziness. That's BPPV. Now, the interesting thing about BPPV is that any of those 3 semicircular canals can be impacted by BPPV. Now, the most common one is the posterior canal. That means the canal that's in the back. And that canal that's in the back, just with gravity and the position of it, is the most likely source of this problem. So the crystal being dislodged is most likely in the posterior canal. The good thing is, so 90% of the time, posterior canal is the problem. We can do these positional techniques to encourage that crystal to find its way back to its home. Once it's found its way back there, it will sort of settle there and the problem's solved. Now, BPPV will also sort of spontaneously resolve on its own. So in a lot of cases, you could do nothing and just wait, and the crystal will probably find its way back to where it should be. But we do have maneuvers that help speed it up, because sometimes it doesn't, and it takes days or weeks, and you're just debilitated because you can't get up, and you're so fearful of moving your head that you don't really want to drive. You just sort of stay home, and you try not to move because any movement will trigger it. So you've got the posterior canal, it's about 90%. You have the anterior canal, and then you have the horizontal canal. Okay, so the anterior canal, horizontal canal, there are also potential players in this, less common. The horizontal canal is an interesting one because if there's this same problem with the horizontal canal, it is triggered with movements. Generally, if you like lie on your back and a quick head turn to the right or the left, and what will happen is your eyes will do this twitch to one side, just directly to the side. Where if you have a posterior canal problem, your eyes will twitch kind of up and to one side or the other. So it's up in a torsional beat. Whereas if you have a horizontal canal, it'll just beat to one side. Now, the horizontal canal problem is less common, but it can present with this sort of ongoing low-grade dizziness. And this low-grade dizziness throughout the day is one of the types of dizziness that can be a problem. It's a problem because a lot of providers have a hard time understanding it and treating it. It can be an inner ear problem, okay? So having the horizontal canal issue, there's a couple things. One, this crystal can sort of get stuck to it's called the cupula. It's sort of that this clumping of hairs that responds to the flow of fluid. Now, if it adheres to the cupula and weighs it down, then it's almost like you're getting this dizziness just constantly because those hairs are constantly being triggered in one direction or the other. That's one of the reasons you can get sort of just a low-grade dizziness throughout the day. And so that's something that's on the back of our mind when we see someone with low-grade dizziness that has sort of been unexplained, because oftentimes the horizontal canal is a little bit more challenging to catch. Okay, so the reason I bring up low-grade dizziness throughout the day is because when you have vestibular migraine, that's oftentimes how it will present. Not always. I mean, there are definitely scenarios where people have no symptoms, and then when they get their migraine, it's just accompanied by dizziness. But we've definitely had people in the scenario where they have the pain, they have the headache, and then they have dizziness. And the dizziness is just there all the time. We've also had patients that just have attacks of dizziness, so maybe low-grade dizziness, and then it'll ramp up. and maybe they don't have the pain presentation as much, like they don't have the pounding, throbbing sensation in their head. Maybe their neck doesn't hurt as bad, but they definitely have the dizziness, okay? So we've seen that diagnosed as vestibular migraine, along with the traditional migraine symptoms that are accompanied by the dizziness. And then oftentimes it's different than that BPPV presentation. Now, the BPPV presentation is the quick, less than 60 seconds, like intense dizziness. And then the dizziness that's like low grade, like you're on a ship, you just feel off throughout the day. That could possibly be the horizontal canal. But the third system, and just to recap, because I spent a lot of time on the vestibular section, we have the visual system, we have the vestibular system, and now we have what's called a proprioceptive system. Now, this is just referring to the neck, okay? When I say proprioception, it's referring to muscles that are contracting and relaxing and telling our brain where our neck is in relation to our body and space around us, okay? So if we turn our head right, so you can close your eyes and turn your head to the right, and you will know that your head is turned to the right. How do you know that? You know that because your brain gets information from the muscles and from the joints telling it your head is rotated to the right. Now, believe it or not, when someone suffers a spinal cord injury or a stroke, if that connection between the brain and the muscle is impacted somehow, you can lose proprioception. And if you're not looking at your limb, if you're not looking at your leg or your arm, you have no idea where it is. Zero idea. It's kind of a hard concept for most people to grasp because you just don't think about it. You just assume if my arm's behind my body, you know exactly where it is. You can show me 2 fingers or 3 fingers. But sometimes if that's impaired, you have to actually look at your hand. You have to use your vision to understand what's happening. Now, for the purposes of dizziness, we're talking about this and our brain's ability to understand where our neck is. And so what's happening here and why the neck can play into dizziness is if our neck has restrictions, if it's not functioning the way it should, if it's harboring tension, and maybe its resting position is like off to the side or it's rotated a little bit, and these joints way up high don't want to rotate, they don't want to move the way they should. Well, what can happen is that proprioceptive input to the brain can be off, and it's saying like, I'm not really sure where we are. I'm not totally sure like where exactly the head is, because it's like there's a lot of tension and like the head's cocked to the right, and I'm not sure if this is even midline anymore. And so all that noisiness, if it becomes noisy to an extent where like your brain can't really drown it out, you could present with dizziness. And it's just like this low-grade dizziness. You just feel off. You feel like you're on a ship, like your balance is off. And it's there generally like throughout the day. Maybe it fluctuates. You may not notice its connection to the neck. Sometimes people do. Me telling you this on the podcast, maybe you'll start to realize it. But oftentimes there is that connection to the neck. So if your neck is irritated, the dizziness increases. The other thing to look out for is oftentimes you'll notice that you have a history of neck tension. This is almost always true. Someone will say, I've had a history of headaches. I've had a history of like neck pain. My neck has always been a problem. Now, generally there's a period of time, probably years, maybe even decades, where people just have like occasional migraines or headaches. They have neck tension. And that's sort of like their status quo. They're just going through life with those symptoms. And then they hit a point where like, yeah, I had that. And then I woke up one morning and boom, I'm dizzy and it's just never going away. We had Danielle on the podcast, probably a couple months ago that, her story is incredible. But that was pretty much it. I mean, just started one day with dizziness and it never went away, and had a history of some neck headache issues in the past, but it like hit her like a ton of bricks. And she's like, I'm dizzy, I'm debilitated, I can't go to work, I can't do my job. And it was just there to stay. And so all of the neck tension, jaw issues, shoulder, like it all is there, and your body's able to manage it. But if it crosses that threshold, and one of those symptoms is dizziness, sometimes it's really hard to get out of that without treating those underlying problems. It's not like your body will just randomly go back under that threshold unless you really know what's happening and how to treat it. So the third component of this, and this is the neck and that proprioceptive system. And this is the system that's largely overlooked. It's overlooked because it's challenging to diagnose. So say you go to an ENT and they are like, okay, I think it's your neck. They do an image. Well, it's a movement problem. It's not a still picture problem. And so taking an image like an X-ray and MRI isn't going to show it. And let's say they say, okay, like let's make sure your inner ear, your vestibular system is functioning well. Well, we have all this fancy equipment. Like we have great ways to test the inner ear and to test the vestibular nerve, the vestibular organ, make sure it's all functioning well. And sometimes there is a hypofunction or vestibular neuritis, things like that. But oftentimes, like they're not really finding anything there. Meniere's disease is somewhat controversial if you have that diagnosis. I don't know if I would 100% like take that with confidence. I just talked to an ENT that we're going to have on the podcast. I think he'll have some interesting insight into that, so stay tuned for that interview. But as far as the inner ear, we do a decent job of evaluating and treating that, potentially overlooking horizontal canal. There's some tricky things with the inner ear. And then with the vision, we have optometrists, we have vision therapy. Not all optometrists are really educated in understanding how to evaluate and treat a vision issue. And so I would suggest finding a specialist, a vision therapist, someone who can restore the way your eyes coordinate, convergence. We have someone in town we work with who's very good. And then that third component is the neck. And the neck, just like we talk about with headaches and migraines, when it comes to dizziness and the source of dizziness, if you have dizziness that's accompanied by a headache or a migraine, or you've been diagnosed with vestibular migraine, here's my message to you. Taking medication, anti-nausea medication, whatever, migraine medication is managing symptoms, and usually it's not managing it well. You very likely are dealing with this underlying what we call cervicogenic dizziness and a cervicogenic headache. So a headache that comes from your neck and dizziness that comes from the neck. It has to do with this component of that proprioceptive system from your neck being off or carrying enough tension that you just feel like you're off. You're on a ship, you're on a boat, and it's just there constantly. And it'll ramp up, and it'll often coincide with the head pain because the neck is also sending a pain signal. And so you're getting the headache, you're getting the migraine, and you're also getting dizzy. All right. So this stuff starts to add up and make sense when you think of it this way, when you think of it in this context. The vestibular migraine patient, like I said earlier, is one of the most debilitated. And oftentimes we need to be patient in seeing progress because these symptoms of dizziness and these daily symptoms, the brain oftentimes has become hypersensitive to them. And so we have to restore function to a degree. Almost we see progress in the neck and mechanically, and the neck's moving better. And then we have to wait and let the brain calm down. And then we start seeing some improvements in the dizziness. But I want to record this podcast on YouTube, on our podcast platforms, however you're interacting with this. I hope you find this if you have vestibular migraine, because it can be a lonely, kind of hopeless journey trying to find relief. Like I said, there's a lot of different things out there for people that are dizzy. They have their own stories. Oftentimes I find that these people are still dealing with it. And historically, the patients that we've had that interact with these sources online might find them somewhat helpful, but we want to get to the source of what's actually happening, and that's what this podcast is intended to encourage you into. If you're out of state, or especially if you're in state, we want to work with you. We want to help you understand and solve these problems. We want to help you understand what type of provider you might need. And then our virtual coaching program is for anyone with a neck. If you have a neck, you want to understand how to help yourself and take care of it, reach out to us. Hey guys, thank you so much. That wraps up this episode on vestibular migraine. What I want you to do is send this out to anyone you know that might struggle with vestibular migraine and might find this information valuable. Like and follow us. Subscribe to our YouTube channel as we're trying to grow that. Thank you all for being supportive and consistent listeners of this podcast. As always, it's our mission to educate and empower everyone with headaches and migraines so you can break free from a life of fear of your next headache or migraine and dependence on medication. I'll see you next week.